So, we are beginning a new sermon series today. Four portraits, one perspective of Jesus. And through this summer sermon series, we will be taking a look at Jesus through the four different gospels. And it's fascinating, these four perspectives and their differences and their similarities, and how they reveal to us different shades, different sides to this man called Jesus. I want to suggest to you at the beginning of this series that nobody has changed history more than Jesus. Even secular historians, for instance, H.G. Wells, H.G. Wells, you recognize that name, he says, "I am a historian and not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all of history." Easily. And so this morning, as we begin this series, I wanted to take a look at Jesus' world. The world that Jesus was born into. The world that he became incarnate and inhabited. Because it's been almost 2,000 years, so for us, there's enough distance in time and things are enough different that sometimes we kind of look back on that world and Jesus' experience, and we think, well, it feels a little unreal. It feels maybe like a little bit of a fairy tale or a nice story, and I don't think we grasp the realities of what Jesus entered when he became a human. And so in understanding Jesus, which is the goal of this sermon series, I want us to understand the context. I want us to understand the world in which Jesus lived. And so today I just want to share a few things about that world to help set the context for us and to understand him. And I think it's very fitting that the Sabbath I chose to do this. If you have been listening to the news over the last couple of weeks, you have heard about Israel a lot. You have heard about Palestine. You have heard about Gaza. You have heard about Hamas. You have heard about Netanyahu. And Israel is still in the news to this day. And it's still a place of turmoil and conflict. And guess what? It was also in Jesus' day. And it has been going on longer than those 2,000 years. It has been going on for a long time. It is a rough place when it comes to peace and prosperity and quality of life. It is a harsh environment. So just to give you a little background, in about 135 BC, 135 years approximately before Christ was born, the Hasmonean dynasty took root in Israel. And this simply means that it was a family, the Hasmoneans, who were in leadership, who were rulers there in Israel. And it went in succession with different relatives coming into power. And there was a lot of conflict during this time, but they maintained power in Israel until about 63 BC. And then the dynasty, through conflicts and insurrection and the Romans, lost its power. And there was a man named Antipater, and he was a counselor to the Hasmonean ruler. And he held a lot of influence, and he had several sons, one of which was named Herod. You may have heard that name. This Herod, who was the son of Antipater, was the man that would become Herod the Great. But it took some time. So in 43 BC, Antipater was poisoned. And by the way, you study this history, this is how it went. If you were a ruler, you better watch your back. Because there was constant insurrections. There were constant assassinations. There was constant attempts for others to take power. And this group wanted power, and that group wanted power. And so Antipater is poisoned in 43 BC, and civil war breaks out among the children and others who want power. And Herod, who would later become Herod the Great, is just a young man, and he decides he flees to Rome, which was a smart move because the rest of them killed each other. And so while he's in Rome, he gets buddy-buddy with some of the rulers and some of the senators in Rome, and he convinces them that they should make him the leader of Judea and that area. Now, if you know your map, Rome is quite a ways from where Judea and Galilee were. So they didn't really care that much, but it was a crucial spot to hold in the Roman Empire because it kept out the invading forces who were trying to come and conquer Rome or get more power back from Rome. So it was right there on the border, on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. So Herod, who would later become Herod the Great, talked the Roman Senate into appointing him leader. So he went back, he brought an army from Rome, he conquered the rest of the dissidents, and he became Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great, he was a builder. He wanted to be great. He wanted everything he did to be great. He, we would say, needed a lot of attention. Today, we would probably call him a narcissist. Herod put his name on everything. Herod built everything on huge, massive scales. But Herod wasn't dumb and kind of took that Roman, even though, by the way, Herod was from Idumea. Idumea, you've probably not heard a lot about, but it's just south of Judea. And Idumeans were not considered Jews, but some of them considered themselves Jews. And when Herod took over, he insisted that all of those in Idumea convert to Judaism, partly because he wanted to be accepted as a Jew, even though he wanted to rule like a Roman. He wanted it both ways. He wanted the people to accept him and worship him and acknowledge him and say, yes, you're one of us, you're our ruler. But he was buddy-buddy with Rome, wanting the power and the army and the prestige that came from being a Roman ruler. So he was trying to work both sides. Nothing like today, of course, but that happened back then. I know all politicians today work very true to their principles and never compromise. But back then, he was trying to massage things on every front so that he could have as much power as possible. And you may recall it was Herod who rebuilt the temple. And we are told he made it as glorious, far more glorious than the second temple that Ezra had built. And it took a long time to build this temple. But by the time Jesus is born, there is a beautiful, massive temple built with Roman marble and all of the glory that Rome could offer, shining in Jerusalem. It was the talk of everybody who lived in that part of the world. They said when the eastern sun came up, it would shine on that white marble, and they said the temple would shine like the sun itself. And so the people took great pride in this gorgeous temple that had been built. And of course, Herod did it to win the favor of the people that he governed. And so this was Herod the Great. But you should also know Herod the Great was always very aware that someone might try to take his power. And so Herod was so worried about insurrection, so worried about conspiracies, so worried that at some point he would be either assassinated or poisoned like his father, that it was dangerous to be a wife of Herod. It was dangerous to be a child of Herod. In fact, let me get this straight. I have it here in my notes. Herod killed, one wife, killed a mother-in-law. By the way, each of these, because he thought they might be conspiring with someone. And then he killed 3 of his children, 3 of his sons at different times. Now, those were just his family. Imagine if you were his enemies. Herod the Great, when it came to the time where he was very ill and he thought his life would be coming to an end. Oh, thank you. So glad I didn't know that was there. Oh, all right. Where was I? Herod was killing some cicadas, something like that. Oh my goodness. So Herod when he was very ill and realized that his life was coming to an end, and this was around 4 BC, Herod rounded up some of the most popular leaders among the Jews. He put them in prison, and he passed a decree that said, the day I die, you are to kill all these leaders so that at least the people will be crying on the day I die. That gives you the mindset of Herod the Great. Now, just so you know the end of that story, they did round up the leaders, they did put them in prison, and the day Herod died, they set them free. Because Herod couldn't do anything about it. So lucky for them, their prayers were answered. I'm sure that was a scary time for those popular leaders. But this is the kind of man that Herod was. And so when we read that Jesus is born in Bethlehem and Herod hears that there may be a new king, it does not surprise us then that he issues the decree, you remember, in the Bible, that all the young baby boys born in Bethlehem must be killed. All of them, because that's who Herod was. That's how he maintained control. And so that part of the Bible rings very true with what we know about the history of Herod and who he was. Now, Herod would die shortly after that time, and the bad news is his son who took over, it wasn't Antipas, it was like Arigula or something. He only reigned for 2 years, and he was even worse than his father. So bad that Rome just took him off the throne and said, okay, you're making things way worse for us. Rome valued peace. And so Rome always wanted rulers in their different territories that would keep peace with the local people. They did not like insurrection and all of that kind of stuff, and so they got rid of this guy in 2 years, and then it was Herod Antipas who took over, and he would rule now for some 37 or so years, starting around AD 2, I believe it was. And he would be the Herod that we would read about that would be alive during the time of Jesus. And I know that sounds confusing because, yes, they were all named Herod. But they were just father, son, and you know how we do that, Herod the second, third, whatever. But they would take different forms. The other thing you need to know to understand this time period is that the Roman government was going through changes. And during this time, the Roman Empire shifted from being a republic to being the empire. And this occurred in 31 BC when Octavian came back from great military conquests. The Roman Senate named him Emperor of Rome. And he became Julius Caesar. You may have heard that name before. So Octavian takes the name Julius Caesar. And our first Bible passage, if you have your Bibles, you've probably read this before, Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, in verse 1, this is where we pick up the story. In those days, it says, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken in the entire Roman world. And this is the beginning of the story of Jesus. So now Octavian, who has become Caesar Augustus, who has rallied the Roman Empire, he's cultivated more power and centralized more power in the emperor position. He issues this decree. He wants to know how many do we have in this vast empire, because the empire has expanded and grown under him in a way that it never had before. And if you look at a map, the Mediterranean Sea was then called the Roman Lake because they ruled all the territory around the Mediterranean Sea. And this would become crucial because Rome ruled all this territory. It made it much easier for travel and much easier for trade. It started to shrink. What used to be all these competing and fighting nations are now under this time of relative peace under the Roman Empire. And I will say to you, if it had not been for this arrangement, the gospel probably would not have spread like it did after Jesus' coming. It's like God set it up because he needed kind of one world empire so that the news could spread and travel to lands far and abroad. And they could have the backing and the security of this Roman Empire over them. And so unless you think everything I'm saying is really negative, there were some benefits to what Rome provided and what they did by conquering all these other nations. And so he decrees that there's a census. And you know the story. Joseph has to go because his hometown is Bethlehem. Again, something that needed to happen to fulfill the prophecy. And when he gets there, Mary has this baby born in this little town of Bethlehem. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but there's something kind of unique about Bethlehem today, isn't there? It's not in Israel. You have to go through the wall. If you've been to Israel, it's a big deal to get to Bethlehem. They have built this huge wall to protect from terrorism and all this stuff. And then you go and you get on the Arab side, as they say, the Palestinian side, and you can go to this little town of Bethlehem, which is not much today, and it never was much. And now the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the ruler of the universe is born in this little know-nothing town outside of Jerusalem, outside of the capital, outside of Herod's great buildings and the great temple, born quietly in a little stable. Not exactly the place you would think our God would choose. Not exactly the birthplace of a king, a ruler, or someone who would dominate history. But that's where Jesus was born. And Jesus grows up, and you remember that it says later, right after Jesus was born, an angel tells Joseph to get to Egypt, where it'll be safe. That's because that crazy Herod, the middle one, who was only there a few years, that even Rome said, hey, you're too crazy for us. And boy, that's pretty crazy. If you're too crazy for Rome and they remove you, you are really off the chains. So the angel warns Joseph to take Jesus to Egypt. So they go there while that Herod is on the throne. He's only there a few years. And then when he's removed, it's safe. And they come back and they go to a town of Nazareth. And Jesus grows up in Nazareth. And now if you know Nazareth, what's interesting is just next door, probably about 10 minutes away, 10 minutes walk or so, from Nazareth, the next Herod was building another city just for himself. And there would have been a lot of building going on, maybe 10, 15 minutes walk from Nazareth. And what's interesting about that is we know that Jesus grew up and learned the trade of carpenter. Here's another thing you need to know about the world that Jesus grew up in. There were very few trees. If you've been to Israel, you know this. If you haven't been, you may not realize it. Israel is a desert. And let me tell you what doesn't grow very well in a desert. Deciduous trees. What grows well in a desert? Not much. But what do you have tons of in a desert? Rocks. There are huge stones and rocks everywhere in Israel. And really the only place that you have living things like trees and plants and stuff is near the Sea of Galilee, near the River Jordan. Wherever there's water, you'll see the green. But the rest of the country is pretty arid and full of rocks everywhere. It's very rocky country. So it probably won't surprise you to know, what did they build their houses out of? Rocks. Because you could just go get them and you could stack them up. And guess what they built their furniture out of? Rocks. And so when you go to Israel and they excavate from the first century and you get to walk in their homes and their villages from that first century, it's all built of stone. They had tables of stone. They had furniture of stone. They had houses of stone. They had synagogues of stone. Everything was built of stone. And they told us when I was there that the word carpenter used for Jesus could mean stonemason. Because you would build, that's what they built stuff out of. So we kind of get this idea that Jesus was like hammering and sawing. Have you seen these pictures where he's like sawing wood and hammering nails and all of that? And I'm not saying there was no wood. There was wood, but it was in short supply. And so most of what Jesus probably did was work with stone and build things out of stone. And they had to, engineer things and cut the stone and shave it down. And they had different ways. They had to collect rocks. Jesus was probably a pretty strong guy if you're working with stones. Probably got in good shape as a teenager. And this was the world he lived in. Now let's switch from the Romans and their governors to the Jewish people. At the time that Jesus grew up, there was Pharisees and Sadducees. And the Sadducees were the elite. They were the high priest order. They had the power of religion, and they were at the highest positions in the religion of their day, of the Jews. They were still, of course, under Roman authority and rule, but they had the influence and authority over the Jewish people and the Jewish religion. The Pharisees were probably what we would say middle income. They were not the ruling class. They were not the elite. The Sadducees, by the way, were wealthy. The Sadducees got to skim off the top for all the temple and the religious services. And the Sadducees did very well. They were prominent, rich, religious rulers. And they tended, if you'll notice, their beliefs tended to be a little more secular. And the Pharisees had a problem with that. So the Pharisees are this group of people that said, we need to follow God more closely. And it was attracted people that wanted to be more religious and said, we need to be more faithful and we got to move away from politics and we got to serve the true God. And so the Pharisees, who are often kind of given a bad rap in the Bible, were actually trying to do things out of good motives. And they were trying to be faithful and they were trying to follow everything God said. And then you had others like synagogue rulers or synagogue leaders who were just lay people or elders, as we would say today. And then when they would go to the synagogue in their local town, remember the temple was God's place of worship, but when you lived away from the temple, you couldn't go there. So on Sabbath, you would go into the synagogue, and every little town had a synagogue. And by the way, Herod the Great was right there to help you build your synagogue. So you could have your place of worship. The synagogue also served as a community center. It also served wherever marriages and legal kind of things would take place. You'd go to the synagogue. It was the local gathering spot for the Jewish people in their community. And they would appoint elders from their community that would kind of oversee the synagogue. And they would ask different ones to do readings and maybe give a little message each week. So it was a little bit similar to what we do here at church. And so Jesus would have gone to the synagogue. And we recall that at the beginning of his ministry, he was asked to read in his hometown synagogue and read a passage. And they would often do that with different elders. And if you were a guest and you had some notoriety, they would ask you as a special courtesy, hey, come up, read us a passage, share something, and give us a word of encouragement from the Old Testament scriptures. And in the synagogue, they would always have the Torah, the scroll, the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. Every synagogue had one. And they had a special box. It was almost like a little ark that they would put it in, and then they would pull it out for their worship on Sabbath. And that was part of how Jesus grew up. That would have been a part of his life. And so Jesus grows up in this time where there's all sorts of political chaos. There's factions within the religion that he's growing up. And people are just trying to eke out a living. People are just trying to manage. And the Roman Empire has started making the world smaller, and it's becoming more easily to integrate the different cultures, the different languages, and trade is going back and forth. And what strikes me as I studied it is how similar it was to our day. We live in a day and age where the world is getting smaller. We live in a day and age where it's easier to hear from others and communicate with others. And the internet, of course, has shrunk our world to a size so small we can hardly imagine that now we can communicate with people anywhere, everywhere. People watching this sermon right now could be all over the world and watching and participating with us here from only Maryland. And I think the conditions are right, just as they were in the time of Jesus, for the gospel to go out to the world. That God has brought us to a time period much like the time of Jesus. You know what's interesting? As Jesus goes about his ministry and he comes to the end, and the religious leaders, for different reasons, are wanting to put him to death, The Roman government is not quite sure what to do with him. And they arrest Jesus right before his crucifixion, and they bring him to Pilate. And by the way, Pilate is a historical figure. You can see there's inscriptions on different stones that he ruled this specific territory of Judea just for a few years, not a long time. And there was a bunch of chaos during this time period in the 30s AD of who was ruling what, and it kind of got split into different things, and I don't have time to go into all of that, but Pilate is the ruler at the moment when Jesus is brought to him. And you remember that Pilate says, man, I don't know what to do with this guy. I don't know why you guys are so upset. He's done nothing that I can execute him for. The Romans had strict set of laws and how you do your trials, and Jesus, there was nothing on which Pilate could fulfill their wishes to crucify him. And so what does Pilate do? Do you remember? He passes the buck to Herod. The good news for Pilate is Herod happened to be in Jerusalem. Herod did not live in Jerusalem. He did not even rule Jerusalem, but he did rule the whole territory. He was above Pilate. And so Pilate, knowing that Herod was in Jerusalem, said, well, this is easy. I'll just pass it on to the guy above me, let him deal with it. And he sends him to Herod, and it says specifically in Luke 23 that Herod was thrilled because Herod had wanted to see this guy. He had heard about him, and if you look at verse 8 of Luke 23, it says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some sort of sign. So he'd heard he had worked miracles and done all these things. So he's like, all right, hey, Jesus coming? Sure, bring him. Let's see what he's going to do. But if you know the story, what did Jesus do? Did he work any miracles? Specifically, it says Jesus refused to answer him. So he comes to Herod. And it says Herod, specifically in verse 10, plied him, verse 11, verse 9, plied him with many questions, but Jesus would give him no answer. And this infuriated Herod. This made Herod so mad that he sent his soldiers and they began to mock him. Herod said, well, fine, if you aren't going to talk to me, if you aren't going to be respectful, if you aren't going to work a miracle for me, because I'm your leader, I'm your ruler, then let's see how you like this. And Herod mocks him, they beat him, they put an elegant robe on him and say, oh, you're a king? Let's see how this works out for you. Remember, Herod, not too much of a fan of other people saying they're a king. And Jesus remains silent. And I find that fascinating. When you look at the life of Jesus, and you compare him to the rulers of his time and of his day and the rulers of all time, everything Jesus did was counterintuitive to what a great leader should do. Everything Jesus did was counterintuitive to starting a great movement. Everything Jesus did should not have had any success. It should have been a dismal and absolute failure. And yet, as we read when we started, he became the historically most significant person to have ever lived on this planet. He changed our world more than any one man has ever changed our world. And here he is before the greatest ruler of his area, his territory, and he is absolutely silent. Won't even speak to him. Won't even acknowledge Herod's right to rule or give him some praise or try to cut some deal or say, hey, we can work this out. Jesus is silent. So Herod sends him back to Pilate. He's like, all right, I got nowhere with this guy. Puts him in the robe, beats him up, sends him back to Pilate. Now Pilate is not happy about this. And so he just says to the Jews, hey guys, I'm so tired of dealing with this. Go away. There's nothing I can do. Bye-bye. And the Jews and the mob become so angry and start screaming, crucify him, that finally Pilate says, all right, I just want this to be done. I'm sick of dealing with it. Go ahead. We'll crucify him. And Pilate sends him out to be crucified. And there, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords walks up the hill, can't even carry his own cross. Simon is grabbed, and he is crucified between two thieves. And I love this quote. from George MacLeod. George MacLeod summarizes it this way. He said, Jesus was not crucified in a church, between two candles, but on a cross, between two thieves. A place so cosmopolitan they had to write his name in 3 languages. It was the town garbage heap, where thieves cursed and cynics hurled insults and soldiers gambled. That is where he chose to die, and those are the people he chose to die for. And by the way, that is where the church needs to be, and those are the people we ought to care for as well. This remarkable life of Jesus, in this remarkable time in Earth's history. I remember talking to a missionary. He was one of my elders in one of my churches years ago, and he had had the privilege of serving in many different areas of the world. And he had grown up in India and first began working for our church in India. And then he got a call to go and serve in Thailand. So he went as a missionary to Thailand. And then he got a call to serve as a missionary in Lebanon and work in our university in Lebanon. And then he got a call to come to America and work for our church here in America. And of course, that's where I ran into him. And I was talking to him. He said, Rick, he said, it was being a missionary that I finally realized why Jesus was born in Palestine, why he was born in the Middle East. And that got my attention because I never really thought about it. And I said, okay, why? He says, let me tell you. He says, I've served in India, I've served in Thailand, I've served in the Middle East, I've served in America, I've visited other parts of Europe and other parts of our world. And he says, I want to tell you something. He said, if Jesus had been born in India, there wouldn't be Hinduism, it would all be Christianity. He said, if Jesus had been born in Thailand, you wouldn't see little statues of Buddha everywhere, you'd have statues of Jesus everywhere. But he says, when I went and served in the Middle East, he said, that is the hardest place I've ever tried to serve. He said, they've had so much violence. They've had so much trauma and drama and crisis and wars. He said, it is a hard place. And the people are hard. And he said, I realized that Jesus picked the hardest place on planet Earth. The place where if they would accept him there, we would accept him everywhere. The place where they were the least open, the place where they were the most violent, the place where they were the most resistant to his message. That's where Jesus chose to be born. And I had never thought about that before. And I said, well, that's beautiful. Because not only did our God come to help us, not only did our God come to save us, but he came into the worst part of where we are. He came into the worst world environment. He came into the worst religious environment. And he said, I have a message of good news that shall be for all people. And you know what? He's still doing that today. You see, our God delights to come into the worst. When you're at your worst, when you're going through your worst, he wants to be there with you. That's where he shows up. That's where he specializes. He's like, oh, we got a crisis on aisle 9 in bay 4. I'm there. We've got a crisis with this person here. I'm there. We've got something going on here that is impossible. Send all the angels and the Holy Spirit. Let's get to work. This is where I specialize. These are the people I care about. This is my mission. You remember in John chapter 3, that famous passage. John 3:16, of course, we all know. It's the most famous scripture probably of all time. But we often just stop at John 3:16. But the next verse is so powerful. For it says in John 3:17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. When you think of all that was going on at the time Jesus lived, I find it fascinating, and I'm not going to make a big sermon out of it, but I just want you to think about it because I'm not even quite sure what to do about it myself. I find it fascinating that Jesus didn't take on all the corruption in the government, that Jesus didn't take on all the injustice that was around him, that Jesus didn't take on all the different things that were going on all around him all the time, but Jesus just humbly showed us how to live. That Jesus just went about teaching the truth about God, the good news about his kingdom. That Jesus just sacrificially laid down his life for these corrupt, horrible people just like you and I. That he did not come to condemn what could have so easily been condemned, what deserved to be condemned. But his mission was not to condemn, but to save. And you know, sometimes I think we get the wrong picture of God. Sometimes we think, well, you know, God, I have to get things right and do what I should, and if I don't, he's going to punish me and he'll be upset. And God is just this amazingly gracious person who, when we're at our worst, he's at his best. When we're the most unlovable, his love is the strongest. And over, he shows this incredible love, this agape love, this divine transcendent love for humankind that surpasses our actions, surpasses our government, surpasses our religions, surpasses our corruptions, our injustices, and just the horrible, insane way that we orchestrated our world. And it just penetrates down to the core and says, I love you this much. And he takes our nails. And he takes our crown of thorns. And he takes our lashes. And he says, you're my child. And I came all the way from heaven to get you. And I'm not leaving without you. I don't want to go back without you. You are mine. The Jews tried to keep Christ contained within their law. This is a quote from J.B. Phillips. While the Greeks sought to turn him into a philosopher, the Romans made him of an empire, the Europeans reduced him to a culture, and we Americans have made a business of him. God may thunder his commands from Mount Sinai, and men may fear, yet remain at heart exactly as they were before. But let a man once see his God down in the arena as a man, suffering, tempted, sweating, agonizing, and then finally dying a criminal's death. It is a hard man, indeed, who is untouched by this. This is the God. This is the God that entered our world. When we reflect and think back on what we've been through over the last year and a half, it's pretty startling. I was just listening to some commentators who were saying, never in recent history has our world gone through such a major global event. And it wasn't just the pandemic, though that was huge. COVID-19's everywhere. There's quarantines. There's masks. We have deaths. We have isolation. All the incredible changes. Businesses are lost. People are changing jobs. We're all at home. Schools are closed. Amazing changes, drastic changes in our world. And at the same time, all sorts of other things are happening in our society. There's an election, there's George Floyd, there's justice movements and social movements and cancel culture and all these things all happening in the last year and a half. It's almost hard to believe what we've been through. And we may look back on it and say, man, this is just an insane world, and what's next? Well, the cicadas apparently are next. If the rivers start to turn to blood, I will be taking notice. It is a little interesting, things that are happening these days. But what's around the corner? People are asking, will life be the same again? Is there another variant coming? Is there another thing? I heard there's a swine flu again somewhere, and there's a different variant in India that may not be treated by the vaccines. And you hear all these little rumors, and you just go, oh no, please. Not something else, not more. Can we at least get a little breather to recover? And no matter what is happening in our world today, I hope that through this glimpse this morning, we have recognized that no matter what happens, Jesus comes into that world. No matter how bad it is, in fact, the worse it is, the more likely God shows up. And so no matter if it's a pandemic, if it's social justice issues, if it's government issues, if it's poverty issues, if it's financial issues, economic issues, health issues, whatever it is, whatever we face, whatever we go through, we can be assured Jesus will be in the middle of it. Because he has come to save. He is the Savior. He changed our world 2,000 years ago, and it has never been the same. And he will do that again right now, right here, and he will do it in your life. Because no matter what you're going through, even if it's not a global catastrophe, you may be going through something this morning that is a catastrophe to you. It is a crisis that you don't know how to deal with, that you don't know how to handle. And I encourage you with these words, for God did not send his Son to condemn you, but he's come to help you. He's come to save you. He's there for you. And this little penniless preacher that was born in a stable, that was crucified on a hill between two thieves, he has a heart for the marginalized. He has a heart for the oppressed. He sees those that are hurting. He cares about those that are cast out of religion. He cares about those that choose the wrong professions, that live the wrong lifestyle, that don't match up by society's standards, that don't have everything that this world says you need to have, that don't drive the right car or wear the right clothes, that speak with an accent or have a physical disability. He cares for those people. Those are the people he came for. He didn't care about Herod because Herod didn't care about him. He didn't care about Herod's power. He didn't care what Herod could do to him. But you know what? He spoke to some women as he was going up the hill of Calvary, Golgotha. You know what? He saw his mother while he's hanging on the cross. You know what? He spoke to a thief who was nailed there with him and gave him hope when the man was on his last breath. Those are the people Jesus noticed. Those are the people Jesus came for. And so no matter what you're going through, where you're at today, whatever happens in our world, whatever massive drastic change is next, whatever plague or economic hardship is coming, the good news is Jesus is there. The good news is Jesus is with you. The good news is that Jesus wants to help you, that he came to save us, that he's prepared a place for us, that he made a way, that everything is taken care of. And even if you get drug in before the leaders of your day and age, even if you're condemned, even if that day comes where we have to testify for our faith, where we have to stand up and answer for the belief that we have in this Jesus, he will be right there with you, standing next to you. And even if it costs you your life, it will be worth it. Just as it was worth it for him. Because in giving his life, he started a revolution. In dying, he created a movement. In losing power, he became the most powerful man that has ever walked this planet. For Jesus of Nazareth, this is Philip Schaff, he says, Jesus of Nazareth, without money, without arms, he conquered more millions than Alexander the Great, than Caesar, than Mohammed, than Napoleon. Without science and learning, he shed more light on human things and divine than all philosophers and scholars combined. Without the eloquence of school, he spoke such words of life as were never spoken before or since. And he produced the effects which lie beyond the reach of any orator or poet. Without writing one single line, he set more pens in motion. He furnished themes for more sermons, orations, discussions, learned volumes, works of art, and songs of praise than the whole army of men of ancient and modern times. That's who this Jesus is. He's a powerful friend. He's a powerful ally to have. And if you walk with him, you're walking with the most powerful person that has ever walked this planet. And he knows what you're going through because he walked in your flesh. He walked in your feet. He saw the world with your eyes. He touched the world with your hands. He experienced what it was to be human. And humanity has never been the same, and the world has never been the same. So I don't know what you're going through today, but I know someone who will be there with you. I don't know what crisis may be around the corner. I don't know if you're in one right now, if you're just coming out of one, or if you're about to go in one, because that's kind of all our choices right now. But I know that Jesus will be there. And I know that he will save. And I know that he can. And I know that he wants to. And so the question for us is, will we let this Jesus matter to us? Will he be life-changing for us personally? Will we invite him into these crises? Will we let him save us? Will we trust him not to condemn us, but to love us and to get us through no matter what we face and whatever we're in? Are we doing the walk with Jesus? Or are we doing it on our own? Thank you. Jesus is the answer. He is the one of all in this world. You can study any other philosopher, thinker, pastor, preacher. You can read whoever you want to read. You can research whatever you want to research. But you will never find in anyone else what you will find in Jesus. He stands alone. He's unlike any other. And I encourage you, whether you've made the choice already, or you need to recommit, or you need to make that decision first and foremost in your life, put Jesus first. Invite him into every aspect, and especially during those crises and trials, he is there for you. For I came not into the world to condemn, but I came to save the world.